So in the last episode, I showed you this project where I basically introduced the basics of SFML resources. So this was textures, sprites, text, font, music, and sounds. And I also showed you this sort of thing. I created the texture in the class constructor, and then I set the sprite's texture using this texture, and when we went to run the program, the sprite was just drawn as a white rectangle. And I also tried to explain this in the last episode, and just to remind you, it was because the rectangle-shaped class owns a pointer to a texture, rather than actually owning a texture itself. And this pointer to a texture was actually given to the class via a function. This means that the rectangle-shaped pointer to a texture is actually pointing to a texture that exists outside of the class. In other words, we have to make sure that this texture exists when it's getting drawn. And then I showed a potential solution to this problem would just be to put the texture as a member of the class. However, the problem with this is that if you look at a game such as Mario, you can see that several sprites are just using the same texture. And if the rectangle-shaped class is just pointing to a texture outside of the class, then it makes the classes actually owning a texture quite pointless, because why would I want to load the same texture multiple times? Because, that would be very inefficient. So of course the solution would be to store each resource once, and we can do this by using a very simple resource manager. So back in the SFML engine that we've been creating in episodes 1 to 4, I've just created a new folder called Resource Managers. And then in this folder I've created a header file called resourcemanager.h. So go ahead and do this now. So for now, let's just create 3 classes. The first class is just going to be called Texture Manager. The second class is going to be called Sound Manager. And the third class is going to be called Font Manager. So that's just 3 classes: Texture Manager, Sound Manager, and Font Manager. And of course, we also have to include a few headers. So the first header is just going to be SFML Graphics, and the second header is going to be SFML Audio. So right here, we have 3 classes to hold our SFML resources. And you probably noticed that Music Manager is missing, and that's because it's slightly different, and we'll get to that in a later episode maybe. So anyways, these resource managers are going to be storing the resources in a standard map data structure. This is actually a template class with 2 template types, a key value and a data type. For the key values of our map, we're going to be using an enum class, and for the data type of our map, we're going to be using a SFML resource. Of course, depending on the resource manager's type, for example, the texture manager is going to be storing SF textures for the data. For example, let's look at a game such as Mario, where you might have an enum class for the texture names with texture names such as Mario, Koopa Red, Koopa Green, and Goomba. And then if we were to add the Mario sprite into an STD map called textures, first of all, we'll create the texture and then load it from the file. And then it's as simple as saying textures to insert, and then it's the enum class's texture name, and then the texture that you want to insert into the map. And then bang, in the key value of texture name Mario, we have the Mario texture. And then if we want to set the rectangle shape's texture using this texture, we just have to get the texture by saying textures.at texture name Mario. And that will return the texture stored at the key value in the map of texture name Mario. So anyways, off camera, I've just created 3 more header files: font manager.h, sound manager.h, and texture manager.h. So I'm then just going to copy and paste these classes into their respective header file. So that's texture manager in texture manager.h, sound manager in sound manager.h, and font manager in font manager.h. And then I just cleared out the resource manager.h header file. Okay, let's start off with the texture manager class. So of course, the first thing we need to include is, or re-include the SFML graphics header. And then I have to include another header file, which is just map, and this has the std map data structure inside of it. And then just above the class, let's create an enum class, and we're just going to be calling it texture name. So as I mentioned earlier, this class is going to have an std map. So the std map in this one, the key value is just going to be texture name, and it's going to be storing SF textures. We're just going to be calling this mtextures. So this class also needs a constructor, so let's just call that texture manager. So this class also needs a function to return textures from the std map. So this function is just going to return a const reference to an SF texture, and this function is just going to be called get. And the arguments of this function is just going to be a texture name, which is the enum class, and it's just going to be called name. And this function is also going to be marked as const. So this class also needs a function so we can easily add stuff into the std map, and this function is just going to be a void function, and it's going to be called add resource. And this is going to take in two arguments. The first argument is a texture name, which is, the enum class. And the second argument is going to be a const reference to an std string. And this is going to be the file path to the texture. So now that we've declared our functions, let's press F11 to create the .cpp file, and then include the header file, which is just texturemanager.h. And I'm just going to right click, insert all class methods or implementation, and then just press OK, and this will implement the functions. So for now, the constructor is just going to be empty. In the get function, we're literally just going to return textures.at name, and that will return the texture stored at the key value of name. So in the add resource function, the first we have to do is create a SF texture, and let's just call it texture. And then we have to load this texture up from a file, so that's just texture.load from file, and then pass in the file path. And now that the texture is created, we can just add it into the map. So that's just mTextures.insert std make pair, and then it's just the texture name, which is name, and then the texture itself, texture. I don't know why this happens, but when CodeBlocks implemented the functions, it didn't include the SF bit. So you might have to do that if you added the functions the way that I did. So that's actually the Texture Manager class pretty much complete. So let's move on to the Sound Manager class now. So the first thing we have to do is just include the header files. The first header file is SFML audio, and the second file is map. So the Sound Manager class is actually going to be pretty much exactly the same as the Texture Manager class. So I'm just going to shamelessly copy and paste all this into the Sound Manager class. And of course, I just need to add the enum class sound name above the class. So of course it's not going to be exactly the same. We have to change a couple of things. So the first thing we have to do is change the constructor name to be Sound Manager. We have to change SF texture to be SF Sound Buffer. So that's just there and there. And then we have to change texture name to be sound name. So then I'm just going to press F11 to create the .cpp file, and then I'm just going to include the Sound Manager header file. So again, the .cpp file is going to be pretty similar to the Texture Manager one, so I'm just going to, again, shamelessly copy and paste it over. And again, we just have to change a few things. For example, we have to replace texture name with sound name. We have to replace Texture Manager with Sound Manager. So we have to do this in quite a few places, actually. And of course, change SF texture to SF Sound Buffer. SF texture to SF sound buffer. And then I'm just going to change the name of this to be sound, because obviously it's not a texture anymore. So that's actually the Sound Manager class complete for now. So the final manager is the Font Manager. So as per usual, we just have to include a couple of headers. This is just going to be SFML graphics, or HPP, and map. And then above the class, let's just create an enum class called Font Name. So like the Sound Manager, this is again going to be very similar to the Texture Manager. So we're just going to very shamefully this time copy and paste all that into the Font Manager class. And again, we just have to change a few things. We have to change Texture Manager to be Font Manager. SF texture becomes SF font. Texture name becomes font name. And let's just change this to be called fonts. And I think in the Sound Manager, we forgot to change the name of that, which doesn't really make sense. Yeah, we forgot to change the name of that. So let's just, in the Sound Manager class, let's just change that to be called msounds. That's msounds. Alright, sorry about that. Right, so let's just press F11 to create the .cpp file now. So the first thing we have to do is, of course, include the Font Manager header file. And again, we're going to very shamefully copy and paste all this into the Font Manager .cpp file, because again, it's very similar, like I already said. So don't worry about all of this copy and pasting. We're actually going to be doing something a bit different in the next episode where we refactor all these classes so that we're basically not just copy and pasting the same class over and over again, which is actually an anti-pattern. So anyways, in the font manager class, let's change texture manager to be called font manager. So let's just change that there, and there. We have to change M textures to be M fonts. Ooh, M fonts. And this has to be changed to font. Texture name has to be changed to font name. Oh, I spelled that wrong. There we go. And of course, the get function is going to be returning an SF font and not a texture. So that's the font manager class pretty much completed now. So anyways, I'm going to go ahead and create another header file. This header file is just going to be in the same folder as the resource managers. And it's just going to be called resource holder .h. So this header file is actually going to contain a struct rather than a class this time, and this struct is just going to be called resource holder. Now, struct is basically just the same as class, but rather its members are public by default. In a class, the members are actually private by default. So this struct here is just going to be bringing all of our resource managers into a single struct, which makes them easier to use and access. So of course, to do this, we have to include the resource manager header files. That's texture manager.h, sound manager.h, and font manager.h. So this resource holder is just going to hold an instance of texture manager, and it's just going to be called textures. It's going to hold an instance of sound managers, and it's just going to be called sounds, and it's going to hold an instance of font manager, and it's just going to be called fonts. And that's the resource holder struct completed. So this resource holder here is just going to be stored by the application class. So in application.h, let's include the resource holder header file. There it is. And so yeah, let's create an object, resource holder, and let's just call it mResources. So we also want to create a getter for this resource holder, so let's return a constant reference to it. So that's just going to be a constant reference to a resource holder, and this function is just going to be called getResources. And then seeing as this function is not going to be changed in the class, just mark it as const. Let's actually implement this function now on the application implementation file. So I'm just going to be using code blocks to implement the function, and then it's just as simple as return mResources. So let's actually test if all these resource managers work now. In the description of this video, you'll find a download link to a folder called res. Inside of this res folder, you'll find 4 more folders: a textures folder, a sounds folder, and a fonts folder, and a music folder. And you'll find that all of these have something inside of them. So please download this folder and place it in the root directory of the project. So we're going to be making use of the enum classes now. So I'm just going to be adding test into all of these enum classes. In the texture manager constructor, we're just going to be loading up this texture into our program. So to do this, we just have to say add resource. So the texture name is just going to be test. So that's just texture name test. And then the file path of this is just res textures face.png, and because that's where it is, it's in res textures, and the name of this texture is face.png. So now we're going to be loading up the sound, and this is going to be in the sound manager class. So to do this, it's just going to be add resource again, and then it's just sound name test, and then it's just the file path, which was res sounds, and then it was called sound.odg. And then finally, we're just going to be loading up this font into our program. So in the font manager class, let's just do add a resource, and it's font name test, and then this font was stored in res fonts, and it was called rs.ttf. So now that all of our resource managers have some kind of resource, we're going to go into the plain state class and add a few objects. And these are going to be the same objects that we used in the last episode. They are the objects that actually use the resources. So we actually have to include a few headers here. The first header is SFML graphics, and the second header is SFML audio. So the object that uses textures is SF rectangle shape, and we're just going to be calling it shape for now. The object that uses sound is SF sound, so let's just call it sound. And the object that uses the font is SF text, and let's just call it text. So in the constructor of the plain text, we're basically just going to be adding the resources into these classes which are meant to be using them. So in the constructor of the class, the first thing I'm going to do is just set the size of the rectangle shape to be 500 by 500. So that's just shape.setSize and then 500 by 500. Notice the curly braces. And then I'm just going to set the SF text to actually say something, otherwise it won't actually display on our window. So I'm just going to say text.setString, and it's just going to say hello. So let's actually text to our rectangle shape now. And to do this, we're going to be using the resource holder, which is stored by the application class. So this is going to be a bit of a mouthful. So that's just shape.setTexture, address of application.getResources.textures.get, and then it's just texture name test. And of course, to actually use the function from the application class, like the compiler errors are saying, we have to actually include the application header file. So that's just include application.h. Now, I don't know about you, but this line here is obviously pretty horrible. So to make it a bit neater, I've added a few functions in the base GameState class in GameState.h. These are 3 protected functions: getTexture, getSoundBuff, and getFont, and they just return the constant reference to their respective resource. And of course, they also take in the texture name, sound name, font name, so that they actually know what texture, sound buffer, or font to get from the resource holder. And they are all const functions. So I highly recommend you do this quickly. So anyways, in the GameState.cpp file, I've then just implemented empty function definitions for those 3 functions there. So the first thing we have to do is actually include the application header file. So that's just include .application.h. So first of all, let's do the getTexture function. So that's just mp application.getResources.textures.get and then pass in name. And of course, we just have to return this from the function. And the other 2 functions just have the same basic idea. But rather than returning a texture from the sound buffer one, it's just going to be returning the one from the sounds, and from the fonts, it's going to be the fonts. And thanks to this, we are able to reduce all of this down to just getTexture. And that looks much better. Okay, so let's set the font of the text now. So that's just text.setFont, and then it's just getFont, font name, test. And then for the sound, it's just sounds dot set buffer get sound buff, sorry, sound name test. So before we can actually test this out, we need to add another function into the display namespace, and this function is just going to be called void draw, and it's going to take in a const reference to a SF drawable object. So SF drawable is basically just a base class of every drawable object in the SFML library. So SF text inherits from it, SF rectangle shape, they are all part of the SF durables. So anyways, let's actually implement this function now, and to do this, it's as simple as saying window draw and then passing in the drawable object. And that's it. So now that our display namespace has drawable functionalities to, draw SF drawable objects, we are just going to include it in the plain_state.cpp file. So that's just include display.h, and then in the draw function, we're just going to say display draw shape display draw text. So hopefully when we run the program, we can see a rectangle shape and some text drawn onto the window. There we have it. We can see that our rectangle shape is textured and it's drawn onto the window, and our text is, has a font and it's drawn onto the window. And for sound, we can just literally say sound.play, and that's it. So when we run this program, hello world, you can see it played a little sound. And that's it. That's our resource manager completed, pretty much. So this episode was a lot longer than usual, so I'd like to quickly recap what we've done. So first of all, we created a bunch of resource managers who basically hold SFML resources such as SF Texture, SF Sound Buffer, and SF Font. We then joined all of these classes together into a single resource holder strut so that we're easy to hold and access. This resource holder is owned by the application class, and we also added a getter function so that it can be returned from the class so that other classes are able to use resources. So specifically, the classes that have direct access to these SFML resources are the game states. As you can see, the game states have a pointer to the application class, which means they're able to directly access these resources, as can be seen in these functions I created in the game state class here. So to test this out in the playing state class, we just created a bunch of SFML objects and then set the font, the texture, and the buffer of these objects using the SFML resources stored by the resource managers. And then in the display namespace, we created a function so we could draw SF drawable objects. And then using this new function in the display namespace, we just draw our rectangle shape and our text, and the final result was this, basically. So that's it for this episode. I'm sorry it was so long, but there's quite a lot to cover. So thank you for watching, and goodbye.